She was on her knees in the dirt, her only dress torn to pieces. Her mother's brooch lying in the dust at the feet of the woman who destroyed her. 300 people watched. Not one of them helped. But from the far end of that street came the sound of hooves. And a voice that silenced the whole town said two words that changed everything. They tore her dress apart in the middle of Main Street. The fabric ripped with a sound like something dying. Buttons scattered across the dirt like broken promises, bouncing and rolling and catching the light before settling into the dust. Clara Whitfield stood there in her white cotton undergarments, trembling, exposed, humiliated, beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Her honey blonde hair had come undone from its careful pins and fell in tangled waves around a face streaked with tears she was fighting not to shed. Three women stood around her with satisfied expressions, their hands still holding pieces of torn navy blue fabric. Mrs. Cordelia Pruitt stood at their center, tall and thin and immaculate, her lips curved into a smile that had nothing to do with kindness. Behind them, the town of Elk Ridge watched from boardwalks and doorways and windows. Men turned away in embarrassment or disgust. Women peered out with expressions that ranged from horror to guilty fascination. Children stood frozen. No one moved to help. No one spoke in Clara's defense. Her mother's cameo brooch lay in the dust at Cordelia Pruitt's feet. The pin was bent, but not broken. Clara knelt slowly and picked it up with shaking hands, pressed it against her chest, and refused to cry. She would not give them that. She would not break in front of these people. She had survived worse than this. She had to believe that. She had to. But then from the far end of the street, the sound of hooves. Three riders on powerful horses, moving fast, dust rising behind them like a gathering storm. Three tall, broad-shouldered silhouettes against the afternoon sun, and a voice cold and steady as mountain ice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. That's enough, and everything changed. If you want to see how three mountain brothers' fury transformed a woman everyone rejected into someone no one dared touch again, stay with me until the very end. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, and I share new frontier stories every week. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now let me take you back. 2 months before that moment on Main Street, 2 months before Clara Whitfield learned what it meant to be defended by men who meant every word they said. Back to the beginning when she stepped off a stagecoach and into nothing. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Elk Ridge General Store, sending up a cloud of dust that settled over Clara Whitfield like a veil of disappointment. She climbed down carefully, her small frame making the wooden step creak only slightly, but in the silence of this frontier town carved out of Wyoming wilderness, every sound carried. Every eye turned toward her. Every whisper reached her ears. That the mail-order bride, Lord, she's a tiny thing. Marsh sent for that. Clara kept her chin up, though her cheeks burned. She was 22 years old, and she looked younger than that. Small, barely 5 feet and 3 inches, with a delicate build that made strangers underestimate her before she'd ever opened her mouth. Her hair was honey blonde, pinned carefully in a modest updo her mother had taught her, with soft tendrils escaping around her temples, despite her best efforts. Her eyes were cornflower blue, large and expressive, the kind of eyes that showed everything she was feeling, whether she wanted them to or not. She wore her only dress. Navy blue fitted bodice with a modest neckline showing her collarbones, long sleeves with small lace details at the cuffs. She had made it herself, sitting by candlelight in their cold Boston room, while her mother lay dying in the next bed, stitching by feel, when the candle guttered low, pouring into every seam, the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, a better life was waiting. The fabric was good quality, but showing its age, now slightly dusty from 3 weeks of travel, carefully repaired at the waist where the stitching had begun to give. A small cameo brooch, her mother's only piece of jewelry, was pinned at her throat. She carried a single carpet bag. Everything she owned in the world. The driver tossed it down without ceremony, and it landed in the dirt with a hollow thud. Everything she had, and it barely made a sound. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. The driver didn't respond. He was already climbing back onto his seat, eager to be gone from this nowhere town at the edge of the known world. Clara smoothed her dress with hands that only trembled slightly. She turned toward the general store. The sign above the door read Marsh's Mercantile in painted letters that were beginning to peel. Harlan Marsh, The man whose advertisement she had answered. The man whose letter she had read and reread by dying candlelight in Boston, memorizing every word, building a future in her mind from the sparse sentences of a stranger. The man whose name she had expected to take as her own before the month was out. She thought about those letters as she crossed the boardwalk. Her father, William Whitfield, had been a school teacher, educated, gentle, perpetually poor. He taught Clara to read before she could tie her own shoes. He taught her arithmetic by counting the cracks in their ceiling. He taught her that dignity was not something the world could take from you unless you let it. He died when she was 12, coughing blood into a handkerchief. He tried to hide from her, and the world got darker and colder and harder after that. Her mother, Margaret, had kept them alive through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. Needlework and church charity, and the fierce determination to raise a proper lady despite having nothing. Margaret taught Clara everything practical she knew. Cooking, sewing, household management, the social graces that had once belonged to a better life. Margaret had been beautiful once before poverty wore the beauty down to bone and shadow. She died of consumption 3 months ago, quietly in the night, and Clara had woken to find her mother's hand cold in hers, and the world suddenly completely, irreversibly empty. The landlord took their rooms a week later. Clara found Harlan Marsh's advertisement in the Boston Herald 2 days after that, sandwiched between notices for patent medicine and land grants. Respectable businessman in Wyoming Territory seeks wife. Must be young, healthy, of good moral character. Will provide home security and fair treatment. Clara wrote back because she had no other options, and because the words home and security felt like water in a desert. Harlan's letters were brief, but not unkind. He described his store, his standing in the community, his practical need for a wife who could keep house and assist with the business. Clara sent her only photograph. Harlan responded that he found her suitable. He enclosed money for the stagecoach fare. Clara pinned her mother's cameo to her dress, packed her carpet bag with her spare undergarments and her mother's Bible in a pressed wildflower from her father's grave, and headed west, banking everything on the word of a man she had never met. Because hope, even borrowed hope, even desperate hope, was better than none at all. She pushed through the store door. A bell jangled overhead, cheerful and oblivious. The store was dim after the bright spring sunshine, cluttered with barrels of flour and beans, shelves lined with canned goods, and bolts of fabric tools hanging from hooks on the wall. The smell of coffee and leather and tobacco wrapped around her. Behind the counter stood Harlan Marsh. He was not what Clara had expected. His letters had suggested warmth, or at least the possibility of it. But the man before her was thin and narrow-featured, with calculating eyes and the pressed, starched look of someone who measured the world in profit and loss. He looked up from his ledger, and his gaze moved over Clara with the cold assessment of someone tallying a column of numbers and finding the sum disappointing. Something flickered across his face. She was pretty. Prettier than her photograph, small and fine-boned and fair, with those remarkable blue eyes, but the flicker died as quickly as it came, replaced by something harder. Irritation. Inconvenience. The expression of a man who had moved on from a decision and resented being reminded of it. Miss Whitfield. His voice was flat. Mr. Marsh? Clara tried to smile. I've come as we arranged. Your letters said... My letters said a number of things. Harlan set down his pen with deliberate care. Circumstances have changed since I wrote them. I find myself no longer in need of the arrangement we discussed. The words hit Clara like stones thrown from close range. She had traveled 3 weeks, spent every penny of the fare money he had sent, left behind everything on the strength of this man's written word. But we had an agreement, Clara said. Her voice was small but steady, the voice of a woman who had learned early that falling apart in front of others was a luxury she could not afford. You sent for me, you paid my fare. I sent fare money which you used. That concludes my obligation. Harlan folded his arms across his narrow chest. I've since become engaged to Miss Lillian Hadley, the mayor's daughter, a woman of standing, a family of appropriate connections. He paused. His gaze traveled over Clara's dusty dress, her worn carpet bag, the obvious poverty she could not disguise no matter how carefully she held herself. You understand, I'm sure. Clara understood perfectly. She understood that she had been replaced by a better offer, that her poverty made her disposable, that this man had looked at her photograph and seen adequate, then met the mayor's daughter and seen advantageous and had not considered for a single moment what his change of heart would cost the woman he had summoned across a continent. "What am I supposed to do?" Clara asked. The question was quiet, practical, stripped of self-pity. "I have no money, no connections here, no way to return east. You brought me here, Mr. Marsh. You're a grown woman, you'll need to find your own way." Harlan's voice turned sharp defensive, the voice of a man who knows he is wrong but lacks the character to admit it. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. As if she were a package delivered to the wrong address. The door opened behind her. Two women entered, their skirts rustling with expensive fabric and self-importance. They stopped when they saw Clara. The taller one, a thin woman with sharp features and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, studied Clara with quick, assessing eyes that cataloged every detail. The dusty dress, the carpet bag, the distress she was trying to hide. "Mr. Marsh," the tall woman said, her voice sugary sweet. "We're here for the ribbon order, unless you're occupied." "Not at all, Mrs. Pruitt." Harlan's entire demeanor transformed. Warmth flooded his face where coldness had been. Deference replaced dismissal. "Miss Whitfield was just leaving." Clara turned slowly. The two women, Mrs. Cordelia Pruitt and her companion, Mrs. Alice Finch, watched her with the fascination usually reserved for curiosities in a traveling show. They took in every detail, every imperfect inch, every sign of a woman whose world had just collapsed. Clara walked past them with her head up and her carpet bag clutched in both hands. The bell jangled again as she pushed through the door into harsh afternoon light. Behind her, she heard Cordelia Pruitt's voice, low and amused. "So, that's the mail-order bride he's been hiding. How unfortunate for her." Laughter, bright and cruel and final. Clara stood on the boardwalk blinking against the sun and against the sting in her eyes. Main Street stretched before her in both directions. A rutted dirt road lined with false-fronted buildings. Horses tied to hitching posts. A dog sleeping in the shade of the saloon. Mountains rising in the distance, still capped with snow, despite the advancing spring. Beautiful and indifferent, and impossibly far from anything she knew. Nowhere to go, no money, no prospects, no one expecting her, wanting her, caring whether she lived or died. She started walking because standing still felt like surrender. Elk Ridge was not large. Maybe 300 souls, most of them men drawn by timber and trapping, copper mining, and government land grants. Women were scarce, which made the ones who lived here powerful in ways Clara understood instinctively. They controlled the social order, decided who belonged and who did not, who was respectable and who was ruined. Clara could feel their eyes on her as she walked, watching from windows, judging from doorways. Word of Harlan Marsh's rejection had already begun to spread through the town with the speed and efficiency of a grass fire. By the time Clara had walked from one end of Main Street to the other, every shopkeeper and housewife and miner leaning against a hitching post knew her story. The mail-order bride nobody wanted, the girl from back east who came all this way for nothing. She tried the hotel first. The Elk Ridge Hotel was a two-story building with pretensions of grandeur, lace curtains in the windows, a painted sign, a lobby with a carpet that might once have been red. The manager, a portly man named Mr. Gaines, looked her up and down when she asked about work. His eyes lingered on her dusty dress, her single carpet bag, the absence of a wedding ring. "Position's been filled," he said flatly. Clara could see through the open doorway that the dining room was empty. The kitchen was quiet. There was no one working. The position had not been filled. It simply was not available to her. She tried the restaurant, May's Kitchen, a simple establishment that served miners and loggers. The owner, a large woman named May Calloway, was kinder than Gaines, but no more helpful. "Honey, you're not what we need. My customers are rough men and you—" She gestured vaguely at Clara's delicate frame. "You'd cause trouble just by being here. Men would fight over a face like yours, and I can't afford the broken chairs." She tried the seamstress, a woman named Mrs. Barnwell, who examined Clara's neat stitching with professional interest and seemed for a moment on the verge of relenting. Then Mrs. Barnwell's husband appeared in the doorway and whispered something about the Marsh girl, and the seamstress's expression closed like a door swinging shut. She tried the laundry, a small operation down by the creek, run by Mrs. Ida Perkins, a gaunt widow with raw red hands and a face carved by years of hard water and harder luck. Two small grandchildren played in the dirt nearby building, something from sticks and stones. I'm looking for work, Clara said. I can wash iron, carry heavy loads. Mrs. Perkins looked up from her washboard. Her expression was guarded, but not unkind. No work, she said. No money for extra help. Hard enough to feed my own. I could work just for food, Clara tried. I don't need much. No, Mrs. Perkins straightened one hand going to her lower back. Wish I could help you, girl. I really do, but wishing doesn't fill bellies. And Clara could see that she meant it. There was genuine regret in the woman's weathered face, the sympathy of someone who understood poverty from the inside. But sympathy did not change facts, did not put a roof over Clara's head or food in her stomach. She tried the blacksmith who laughed at the idea of hiring a woman. She tried the livery stable where the owner said horses did not care about pretty faces. She tried the church notice board where every posting for domestic work specified references required. And Clara had no references, no history, no one who would vouch for her in this hostile little world. She found the boarding house at the edge of town, a sagging two-story structure that looked like it might not survive a strong wind. A hard-faced woman quoted her the price. $2 a week, no meals included. Clara counted out the coins from the small purse tucked inside her carpetbag. She had $5 total, the exact amount of the stagecoach fare Harlan had sent. She paid for 1 week and watched her security shrink to almost nothing. The room was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair with a broken slat, 4 walls and a door that locked. For tonight, that was enough. Clara sat on the bed. The frame groaned but held. She pulled off her shoes, worn through at the heels, and lay back on the thin mattress, staring at water stains on the ceiling that bloomed like grotesque flowers. $3. Enough for another week's rent with nothing for food. Or enough for food with nowhere to sleep. The arithmetic of desperation, and every answer came up short. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would find something. Some way forward. But as she lay there in the gathering darkness, listening to her stomach growl and feeling the weight of failure press down on her chest, Clara Whitfield wondered if there was any such thing as forward for a woman like her. A woman with nothing, wanted by no one, stranded in a town that had decided she did not belong before she ever opened her mouth. She fell asleep still wearing her dress because it was her only dress, and the thought of taking it off felt like letting go of the last piece of her old life. In her dreams, she was home. Her mother was alive. The fire was warm. Someone was calling her name. In the morning, she woke to the cold. The next 3 days followed a pattern that became grimly familiar. Clara would rise early, wash her face in the basin, smooth her dress pin, her mother's cameo at her throat, and walk into town looking for work. Any work. Honest work. And every door closed. On her second day, a man approached her on the street, well-dressed, smiling with the kind of eyes that promised things his mouth never quite said. He introduced himself as Mr. Carson and said he operated an establishment about 5 miles south of town. Room and board included. Good money for a woman willing to work. Clara looked at his smile and saw exactly what kind of establishment he meant. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he assessed her, the way a merchant assessed livestock, measuring value against cost. No, she said firmly. Thank you, but no. Carson's smile cooled by several degrees. You might want to reconsider. Options are scarce for a woman in your situation. His gaze dropped meaningfully to her body, then returned to her face. Not everyone wants a delicate flower, if you understand my meaning. Some men prefer something specific. I said no, Carson shrugged. Your choice. For now. He tipped his hat and walked away, and Clara sat down on the nearest bench because her legs had stopped working properly. That was what it had come to. A brothel keeper measuring her worth in dollars and degradation. Not desirable, but viable. A commodity for appetites she did not want to imagine. She pressed her hands against her face and breathed until the shaking stopped. On the afternoon of the third day, with her money down to pennies and her hope down to fumes, Clara was sitting on a bench near the general store when a shadow fell across her. She looked up. A boy stood before her. Maybe 12, skinny and freckled, with a patched shirt and bare feet despite the cool spring air. He studied her with the frank, unbothered curiosity of a child who had not yet learned the art of looking away from uncomfortable things. You're the mail-order bride Mr. Marsh didn't want, right? Clara's laugh came out bitter and surprised. News travels fast. Everything travels fast in a town this small. The boy shifted his weight from one bare foot to the other. I'm Levi. Levi Briggs. You really looking for work? Any kind, Clara confirmed, as long as it's honest. The boy grinned, and for a moment the weight on Clara's chest lifted just slightly, because a child's grin is a kind of grace that even the worst circumstances cannot completely extinguish. Then you might be in luck, Levi said. Levi led Clara through the streets to a store she hadn't noticed before. Smaller than Marsh's shabbier tucked between the lumber mill and a warehouse that smelled of sawdust. The sign read Harding's General Store, and the man who looked up when they entered was round and kind-eyed with a magnificent handlebar mustache that seemed to have ambitions beyond the face it occupied. Mr. Harding, Levi announced with the subtlety of a brass band. This is the lady Mr. Marsh didn't marry. She needs work. I told her about the Kincaid delivery. Harding's smile dimmed. He studied Clara, taking in her small frame, her fine features, her obvious unsuitability for the work he needed done. But something in his expression suggested a man running out of options. The Kincaid brothers, Harding began carefully, live up in the high country, 3 of them. They need supplies hauled up regular, and I've got a standing order paid in advance sitting in my back room because nobody in this town will make the delivery. Why not? Clara asked. Harding exchanged a look with Levi that communicated volumes. Because the trail is steep and dangerous, because it's a full day's ride through wilderness, and because the Kincaid brothers are... He paused, choosing his words. They're not like other men, Miss Whitfield. They keep to themselves. Don't welcome company. When they come to town, which is rare, people cross the street. My pa says they have killed men. Levi whispered, his eyes wide with dramatic relish. My ma used to say they were half wild. Harding said sharply, but he did not contradict the boy. The truth is something happened to them. To the eldest brother especially. 6 years ago, his woman died in a fire up at their cabin. Some say it changed them, made them hard, made them dangerous. Whether that's true or I can't say for certain, but I can tell you that every able-bodied person I've asked to make that delivery has said no. Clara felt her heart quicken, not with fear, though fear was part of it, with something closer to calculation, the cold, clear arithmetic of survival. How much does it pay? $5 for the delivery, plus whatever the Kincaids tip if they're of a mind to. $5, more than a week's rent, more money than Clara had seen since arriving in Wyoming. I'll do it, she said. Harding tried to talk her out of it. He described the trail in detail meant to frighten. Narrow paths above sheer drops, switchbacks where one misstep would send horse and rider tumbling into ravines. Snow still possible in the high passes even this late in spring. Mountain lions bold with hunger after winter. Clara listened to every word. Then she said it again. I can do it. Just tell me where to go. Harding studied her for a long moment. He was looking, Clara realized, not at her size or her gender or her dusty dress, but at her eyes. At whatever he saw burning there behind the blue. First light tomorrow, he said finally. $5 when you get back. That evening, Clara used her last coins to buy a day-old loaf of bread and a small piece of hard cheese. She ate half and wrapped the rest in her handkerchief for the journey. Then she lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house and tried not to think about what tomorrow might bring. A dangerous trail through wilderness she did not know. 3 reclusive mountain men with violent reputations. The real possibility of getting lost, getting hurt, getting killed. But also $5, maybe more. Enough to buy herself another week of survival, another week of looking, another week of hope. She fell asleep with her hand on her mother's cameo pinned to her dress over her heart. Just let me survive this, she whispered into the darkness. Just let me find a way forward. Just let me be enough. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the mountains. Somewhere in the wilderness, a wolf howled, lonely and wild and free. And Clara, on the edge of sleep, wondered what it would feel like to be any of those things. She woke before dawn, braided her hair with fingers that trembled slightly from cold and nerves, pinned her mother's cameo carefully over her heart, took her carpet bag because she could not trust the boarding house enough to leave her belongings behind, and walked through the silent streets to Harding's store. He was waiting outside with two animals, a sturdy bay mare and a mule already loaded with canvas-wrapped supplies, balanced and secured with the expertise of someone who had packed 100 such loads. "The mare's name is Molly," Harding said, handing Clara a canteen and a small bundle of jerky. "She's sure-footed, which matters more than speed on that trail. Follow Copper Creek north into the high country. Look for blazes on the trees, strips of bark cut away to mark the path. Follow those and you'll find the Kincaid cabin by afternoon. What if I don't find it? Then you come back down before dark. Don't try that trail at night, Miss Whitfield. And don't wander off the path. It's easy to get turned around up there, and we're still getting snow in the high passes." He paused. "One more thing, Emmett Kincaid, the eldest. He's not like other men. Doesn't talk much, doesn't welcome company. He might not even answer the door when you knock. If that happens, just leave the supplies on the porch and come back down. Don't take it personal." "What happened to him?" Clara asked. "Why does he live up there alone?" Harding's face closed like a book shutting. "That's his story to tell, if he's ever of a mind to tell it, which he won't be." He helped Clara mount. She needed the assistance, her skirts tangling, Molly sidestepping nervously at the unfamiliar weight. Harding handed her the mule's lead rope and stepped back. $5 when you get back safe. Godspeed, Miss Whitfield." Clara gathered the reins, feeling the leather stiff and strange in her hands. It had been years since she had ridden, and never anything like the trail Harding described. But she was committed now. The only door that was open, and she was walking through it. She clicked her tongue and nudged Molly forward. The mule followed placidly behind. The town slipped away as she rode north. Buildings giving way to scattered cabins, then to wilderness. The trail began innocently. A well-worn path following Copper Creek through stands of pine and aspen, the morning sun filtering through new leaves, birdsong filling the spaces between the sound of water over stones. Clara let herself breathe. This was not so bad. The air was clean and sharp and cold. Nothing like the sooty heaviness of Boston, and the mountains rose ahead with a grandeur that made her chest ache with something she could not name. But as the sun climbed and the elevation increased, everything changed. The path narrowed. The trees pressed closer. Molly picked her way carefully over rocks and exposed roots, her breathing growing heavier with the climb. The mule plodded behind, unconcerned by the increasing drop-off to their left, where the creek tumbled over boulders and white cascades that grew more distant with every switchback. Clara tried not to look down. She focused instead on the blazes Harding had described, pale scars on dark bark, appearing every 100 yards or so. Breadcrumbs in a wilderness fairy tale, leading her deeper into a world she did not understand. By mid-morning, her legs ached from gripping the saddle, and her hands were cramped from holding the reins too tight. The air grew thinner, colder, carrying the scent of snow from peaks that rose ahead like jagged teeth against an infinite blue sky. The trail switchbacked up a steep slope, and Clara's heart hammered as Molly navigated a section where the path was barely 3 feet wide, the mountainside rising sheer on one side and falling away into nothing on the other. One misstep, one loose stone, one moment of lost balance, and they would tumble down into a ravine where the creek was now just a silver thread far below. Clara's vision swam. Her breath came short. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the relative safety of the town that did not want her to choose slow starvation over sudden death. But she thought about the boarding house room. $3. The look on Harlan Marsh's face when he dismissed her. The sound of Cordelia Pruitt's laughter. The brothel keeper measuring her body with his merchant's eyes. She thought about her mother. 10 years of poverty, and Margaret Whitfield had never once lost her dignity, had never once surrendered to the verdict the world kept handing down. "Good girl," Clara whispered to Molly, her voice tight with fear. "Just keep going, nice and steady." Molly's ears flicked back at the sound. The mare seemed to settle slightly, as if the words themselves provided reassurance. They climbed higher. The sun crossed overhead and began its descent toward the western peaks. Shadows lengthened across the trail. Clara ate the last of her bread, too nervous to save it, and drank water from the canteen Harding had given her. Her back ached. Her legs burned. Her dress clung to her skin with a sweat despite the cold air. What if she had missed a turn? What if the blazes had led her astray? What if Harding's directions were wrong or her execution of them flawed? But then the trail leveled onto a high meadow and Clara saw it. The cabin sat at the far edge of the clearing, backed against a wall of rock and timber. It was larger than she had expected. Solidly built from logs chinked with moss and mud, with a stone chimney and a porch that ran the full length of the front. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. A woodpile stood stacked neatly against one wall taller than Clara. A lean-to stable sheltered 3 horses, big powerful animals, that raised their heads to watch her approach with ears pricked forward. Relief hit Clara so hard she felt dizzy. She had made it. Against her own doubts and the town's expectations and the mountain's indifference, she had actually made it. She dismounted awkwardly, her legs nearly buckling, when her feet hit the ground. Molly nosed at her shoulder as if approving of her determination. Clara tied both animals to the porch rail, smoothed her dress, tried to compose herself. Her hair had come half undone. Her face was flushed. She looked nothing like the composed young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 days ago. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder. "Hello, I have supplies from Harding's store." The door opened, and Clara found herself looking up far up at Emmett Kincaid. He filled the doorway completely. 6 feet and 6 inches of lean, hard-muscled frame that seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. His hair was chestnut brown, longer than fashion allowed, sun-streaked from years of outdoor labor. His face was all hard angles, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, high cheekbones, a straight nose with a slight bump that spoke of an old break. And his eyes. His eyes were the color of whiskey held to firelight. Pale amber, clear and piercing, with an intensity that made Clara feel as if she were being read like a page in one of the books she would later discover on his shelves. Those eyes moved over her face with an expression she could not decipher. Not the disgust she had braced for, not mockery, just a cool, detached assessment that somehow felt more unsettling than either. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and Clara felt pinned in place, small and wind-tossed and entirely out of her depth. "Harding sent me," she managed. "I have your supplies. Where would you like me to put them?" Before Emmett could respond, a voice came from behind him, warm or curious, carrying a note of genuine amusement. Well now, Harding finally found someone brave enough to make that ride. Or crazy enough. Jury's still out. Silas Kincaid appeared beside his elder brother. He was slightly shorter than Emmett, but still towered over Clara with dark blonde hair and warm hazel eyes, and the easy, open expression of a man who had not forgotten how to smile. His smile was in fact the first genuine smile Clara had received since arriving in Wyoming, and something in her chest loosened at the sight of it. "She rode up alone." A third voice, sharp and disbelieving, came from around the side of the cabin. Josiah Kincaid emerged from the woodpile with an axe resting on one broad shoulder. He was lean and fierce-looking, auburn-haired and green-gold-eyed, and he studied Clara with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for strangers approaching armed. "Harding sent a woman, a girl." "I'm 22, Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "And yes, I rode up alone. The supplies are on the mule." The 3 brothers stood before her in a configuration that would become familiar. Emmett at center, silent and watchful, the stone around which the others orbited. Silas to his left, warm and curious, already moving toward the mule to inspect the cargo. Josiah to his right, arms crossed, suspicious, every line of his body communicating distrust. "Everything's here," Silas called from the mule. "Good packing, too. Nothing shifted on the trail." Emmett's gaze had not left Clara's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, from disuse, the sound of a man who rationed his words the way a miner rationed water. "You made that ride, on that trail, in one day, alone." "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question caught Clara off guard. Not what she was doing or where she was going or what she wanted, just why. The real question underneath all the others. "Because I needed the money," Clara said simply, "and because no one else would do it." Something shifted in Emmett Kincaid's expression. Subtle, barely there, gone, almost before Clara could register it. But she saw it. A crack in the stone. A flicker of something that might have been recognition or respect or the beginning of both. He stepped off the porch without another word and began unloading the mule, his movements quick and efficient. Silas joined him, Josiah watched Clara from his position by the woodpile, his arms still crossed, his expression still guarded, but something in his posture had changed. He was no longer dismissing her, he was reassessing. When the unloading was done, Emmett counted coins into Clara's outstretched palm. 5 silver dollars. Then he added 2 more. For making the ride, he said, and for not turning back when the trail got steep. Clara stared at the coins. $7. More money than she had held in months. Enough to survive. That's too much, she said. I'll decide what's too much. Emmett's tone was flat. Final, the voice of a man unaccustomed to being argued with. Silas glanced at the sky where the sun was already painting the western peaks in gold and crimson. She can't ride down in the dark. Trail's too dangerous. She can't stay here, Josiah said immediately. 3 men and an unmarried woman. People will talk. People talk regardless. Emmett looked at Clara. You can sleep in the stable loft. There are blankets up there. It's dry and warm enough. I don't want to impose. Not an imposition. Just sense. Trail's dangerous at night. Mountain lions are bold when they're hungry this time of year. His amber eyes held hers. Unless you'd rather risk it. Clara swallowed. The loft would be fine. Thank you. Emmett nodded once and went back inside. Josiah muttered something under his breath and stalked off toward the tree line with his axe. But Silas lingered, his expression kind. Don't mind Josiah, he said quietly. He's suspicious of everyone. It's nothing personal. And Emmett, something old and minute, moved behind Silas's hazel eyes. Emmett is careful, with people, with trust. He has his reasons. He paused. You did a brave thing today, Miss Whitfield, Clara Whitfield. You did a brave thing, Miss Whitfield, braver than anyone down in that town, and that's worth noting. Silas helped her settle Molly and the mule in the stable. He showed her the loft with its stack of blankets and the lantern hanging from a nail, made sure she had water and the rest of her jerky. His kindness was unhurried, unforced, the kindness of a man who had not forgotten. That gentleness was a form of strength. That night, Clara lay in the stable loft, wrapped in a rough blanket that smelled of hay and wood smoke and horse, and stared through a gap in the boards at the sky. Stars had emerged in their thousands. More stars than Clara had ever seen, more than she had believed existed. They blazed against the blackness with a fierce, cold beauty that made the night feel infinite and made her feel very small and strangely, impossibly safe. Through the floor, she could hear faint sounds from the cabin. Boots on wood, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of 3 voices too distant to make out words, but the rhythm of their conversation was comforting in a way she had not expected. 3 brothers talking by firelight, the sound of family, the sound of belonging. Clara pressed her mother's cameo against her heart. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into nothing, she felt something close to peace. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant singing. The mountains held the stars, and in a stable loft on the edge of the world, a woman who had lost everything whispered a prayer she had whispered 1,000 times before. Just let me be enough. The mountain did not answer, but in the morning coffee was waiting. But what she could not yet know was that this mountain held a secret buried under the floorboards of that cabin in a locked iron box. And when Clara finally found it, nothing between them would ever be the same. Clara woke to the rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood. Gray dawn light filtered through the stable walls, painting everything in shades of ash and pearl. Every muscle in her body protested as she descended the ladder. Her legs felt like they had been filled with sand, and her hands were stiff from gripping the reins all day. Outside, all 3 brothers were already at work. Emmett split logs near the cabin with precise, powerful swings. Silas tended the horses, moving between the animals with easy confidence. Josiah hauled water from a spring somewhere beyond the tree line, carrying 2 full buckets that would have staggered most men as if they weighed nothing. Emmett paused when he saw Clara. The axe rested against his shoulder. Morning light caught the faded scar on his left forearm, puckered and discolored, and Clara recognized the mark of a terrible burn. He saw her notice it and pulled his sleeve down without a word. Coffee's inside, he said. Help yourself. Clara hesitated. I should get back to town. Should eat first. Trail's hard enough without doing it on an empty stomach. The offer was gruff, almost grudging, but Clara's stomach made the decision for her. She nodded and went inside. The cabin was one large room, and it told her more about these men than words could have. The space was clean, organized with an almost military precision. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, embers glowing low. The furniture was simple but beautifully made. Someone here had skill with wood and cared about craftsmanship even in isolation. And the bookshelves caught Clara's breath. Dozens of volumes carefully maintained, ranging from poetry to philosophy to practical guides on trapping and animal husbandry and frontier farming. Tennyson beside a manual on farrier work. Dickens next to a guide for building stone chimneys. These were not the illiterate mountain savages the town imagined. Someone in this cabin was hungry for knowledge and had been feeding that hunger for years. The coffee was strong and hot. Clara poured herself a cup and nearly groaned at the first sip. It was the best thing she had tasted in days. The brothers came in one by one. They ate breakfast together, biscuits, salt pork coffee, simple fare but warm and filling, and given without conditions. Clara observed their dynamics with quiet fascination. Emmett ate in silence, his amber eyes distant, focused on something only he could see. Silas maintained easy conversation, filling the spaces his brother left empty. Josiah watched Clara but said nothing hostile, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a warm welcome. After breakfast, Emmett asked about her situation. Clara told the truth. The mail-order bride arrangement, Harlan's rejection, 3 days of failed job hunting, the boarding house room she could barely afford, the brothel keeper who had measured her like merchandise. She kept her voice steady, presented facts, did not ask for pity. Silas's face darkened as she spoke. Josiah's scowl deepened, directed not at Clara, but at the story itself, at the cruelty of it. And Emmett sat very still, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "Marsh is a coward," Emmett said when she finished. "Always has been. Follows whoever holds the most power." "And Mrs. Pruitt?" Clara asked, remembering the tall woman in the store. All three brothers went still. A different quality of silence filled the cabin. Heavier, darker, charged with something Clara did not yet understand but could feel like electricity before a storm. "Stay away from Cordelia Pruitt," Emmett said. His voice had dropped to something cold and quiet and dangerous. "She's poison. Everything she touches rots." Clara wanted to ask why. Wanted to understand the sudden tension, the way Josiah's hands had clenched into fists, the way Silas's warm smile had vanished entirely. But something in the brothers' faces warned her that this question had teeth, and now was not the time to reach for it. Emmett stood abruptly. "Harding needs someone for regular deliveries. You proved you can handle the trail. I'll pay $5 a trip twice a month. That interests you?" Clara's heart leapt. $10 a month. Not enough to live on entirely, but enough to survive when combined with whatever other scraps of work she could find. "Yes, absolutely." Emmett nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, as if the idea had just occurred to him, rather than having been turning in his mind since the moment she appeared on his porch, he added, "And if you're looking to earn more, there's work here at the cabin. Cooking, cleaning, mending. Things that need doing and nobody here does well. I'd pay $20 a month, room and board included." $20. The number hung in the air like wood smoke. More than most men earn. But the cost was obvious. Living alone with 3 unmarried men in an isolated mountain cabin. Whatever shreds of reputation Clara might still possess would be destroyed completely and permanently. "Think about it," Emmett said, reading her hesitation. "No rush, no pressure, and no expectations. Whatever you decide." He walked out without waiting for an answer. Silas touched Clara's arm gently as he passed. "He means it, every word. No pressure, no expectations. You'd be treated with respect up here. You have my word on that." Josiah said nothing, but as Clara mounted Molly and prepared to ride back down the mountain, the youngest Kincaid brother appeared beside her horse and thrust a bundle wrapped in cloth into her hands. "Venison jerky," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "For the ride down. Trail's long, and you look like you haven't eaten proper in weeks." Clara looked at the bundle, then at Josiah's averted face. It was the closest thing to kindness the youngest Kincaid knew how to offer. Rough as bark and just as honest. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned away before she could see his expression change. Clara rode down the mountain with $7 silver in her pocket, venison jerky on her saddle, and a decision already more than half made in her heart. Behind her, the cabin grew smaller against the rock-faced smoke still rising from the chimney, three tall figures moving through their morning work. She did not look back for long, but she carried the image with her all the way down the trail tucked into her memory beside the sound of Silas's laughter and the weight of Emmett's gaze and the unexpected offering of jerky from a man who would not meet her eyes. The mountain had not answered her prayer, but it had opened a door, and Clara Whitfield had learned the hard way, and the only way that when every safe door closes, sometimes the dangerous one is the only one worth walking through. Clara returned to Elk Ridge by late morning, her body sore from the ride, but her spirits higher than they had been since leaving Boston. The mountains still rose behind her, and the weight of $7 silver in her pocket felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Harding paid her the $5 with obvious relief, his magnificent mustache twitching with something that might have been admiration. "Kincaids give you any trouble?" "None at all," Clara said truthfully. "Emmett asked if I'd be willing to make regular deliveries. $5 each time." Harding's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "He did." Something shifted in his expression, a recalculation of who Clara might be. "Well, that works out well for both of us then." Clara pocketed the money. $12 total, counting Emmett's tip, and something unfamiliar stirring beneath her ribs. Not quite hope, not quite peace. Something in between. Something like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. It did not last. She was walking past Marsh's Mercantile when the door opened and two figures emerged. Mrs. Cordelia Pruitt and Mrs. Alice Finch stepping into the afternoon light with the practiced grace of women who own the ground beneath their feet. They saw Clara and stopped. Cordelia's eyes narrowed with interest. The predatory, calculating interest of someone who has identified a weakness and is already planning how to exploit it. "Clara Whitfield," Cordelia said, her voice carrying the particular frequency of false sweetness that Clara had learned to dread in the 3 short days since her arrival. "I heard you made quite the journey yesterday, all the way up to the Kincaid brothers' cabin, alone." "I delivered supplies for Harding's store," Clara said evenly. "And you stayed the night, I understand." Cordelia exchanged a glance with Mrs. Finch, the kind of glance that communicated volumes without a single word spoken aloud. "How resourceful of you." "I slept in the stable. The trail wasn't safe to ride in the dark." "Of course, the stable." Cordelia's smile was all teeth and no warmth. She stepped closer and her perfume reached Clara, cloying and too sweet, the scent of a woman who used fragrance the way some men use firearms. "You should be careful, dear. A woman in your position can't afford to have her reputation questioned. And the Kincaid brothers, they are not the sort of men a respectable woman associates with." "They paid me fairly for honest work," Clara said, and she was proud that her voice did not waver. "There's nothing disreputable about that." "Perhaps not, but appearances matter." Cordelia's gaze traveled over Clara's dress, her worn shoes, the carpet bag she still carried everywhere because she had nowhere safe to leave it. "Especially for women who have already been discarded." The word landed like a slap. Discarded. As if Clara were something used and thrown away. As if Harlan Marsh's rejection had marked her with an invisible brand that everyone in this town could read. Clara walked away before the woman could see her face crumble. Behind her, she heard their laughter, bright and cutting as broken glass, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Cordelia Pruitt was not merely cruel by temperament. She was cruel by design. She had chosen Clara as a target the way a hawk chose a field mouse, and she would not stop until Clara was destroyed or gone. Over the following week, the poison spread through Elk Ridge with the efficiency of disease through an unvaccinated town. Clara's legitimate delivery work was transformed into something sordid. Her night in the Kincaid stable became a scandal that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Doors that had been merely closed to her before now slammed shut with finality. The few odd jobs she had managed to scrape together, washing dishes at May's kitchen, mending shirts for the hotel, evaporated as businesses refused to associate with the woman whose name had become synonymous with impropriety. On the 5th day, 3 miners caught Clara alone on a side street at dusk. She was carrying a loaf of day-old bread she had purchased with her dwindling coins, walking quickly toward the boarding house, head down, trying to be invisible. "Well, well," the voice came from behind her, rough and whiskey-soaked. "If it isn't the Kincaid woman." Clara turned. 3 men stood behind her, dirty from a day's work at the copper mine. The one who had spoken was grinning through gaps where teeth should have been. "Excuse me," Clara said and moved to pass. A second man stepped into her path. "Don't be like that. Whole town's talking about how you're keeping company with Emmett Kincaid and his brothers, riding up to their cabin, spending nights." "I deliver supplies for Harding's store," Clara said firmly. "That's all." "Sure you do," the first man laughed. "Mighty convenient arrangement. Mountain man gets lonely. You need money. Works out nice." Fear spiked through Clara's anger. The street was empty. Most people had already gone home for supper. The businesses were closing. No one to see, no one to help. "Leave me alone," she said, and she hated how her voice shook. The gap-toothed man reached for her arm. "Come on now, we're not good enough for you. Kincaid's not the only one with coin." "I said leave me alone." The lady said leave her alone. The voice came from behind the miners, cold and sharp as winter wind. They turned and Clara's breath caught. Emmett Kincaid stood 10 feet away. He must have come to town for some errand, though Clara had not seen him on the street. He stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his face expressionless. But there was something in his stillness that screamed danger the way a coiled rattlesnake screams danger. Something in those pale amber eyes that made all 3 miners take an involuntary step backward. "Kincaid," the gap-toothed one swallowed. "We were just talking." "I know what you were doing." Emmett's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm breaks open the sky. "Walk away, all 3 of you. And if I hear you've spoken to Miss Whitfield again, if I even hear you've looked at her, I'll come looking for you. Do we understand each other?" They understood. Survival instinct overcame bravado. They muttered excuses and walked away quickly, shoulders hunched like men expecting a blow that had not yet fallen but still might. Emmett watched them disappear. Then he turned to Clara. "You all right?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hands were shaking. The loaf of bread she had been carrying was crushed in her grip. Emmett walked her to Harding's store without being asked. He did not touch her, did not crowd her, simply walked beside her with his long, measured stride, his presence a wall between Clara and whatever else the town might throw at her. Harding took one look at Clara's face and ushered them both inside without a word. "Those were Pruitt's mine workers," Harding said darkly when Emmett told him what had happened. "Troublemakers, the lot of them." "She's not safe here." Emmett's voice was flat matter-of-fact, the voice of a man stating something as obvious and indisputable as weather. "This town is going to chew her up. She needs to be somewhere people can't get at her." He looked at Clara. "The offer stands. $20 a month, room and board. You'd be out of their reach up there." Clara looked at Harding. The storekeeper's face was troubled but not surprised, as if he had seen this coming since the day she walked into his store with Levi Briggs. "The Kincaids are good men," Harding said carefully. "I believe that. But people will say terrible things, Miss Whitfield. Things that can't be unsaid." "People are already saying them," Clara replied, and she heard the steel in her own voice, thin and bright and newly forged. "At least up there I'd have honest work, a roof over my head, and men who won't let anyone lay hands on me. That's more than this town has offered." The decision was made, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet finality of a woman who had run out of alternatives and chosen the only one that didn't require her to surrender her dignity. She rode up the mountain the next morning with everything she owned strapped behind Molly's saddle. Harding came out to see her off, pressing a bundle of dried apples into her hands and telling her to send word if she needed anything. Levi Briggs appeared from nowhere, breathless and barefoot as always. "You're really going?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made Clara's throat tighten. The sound of a child who recognized kindness and was watching it leave. "I'm really going," Clara said. "But I'll be back for supply runs. You'll see me?" "Promise, promise." She rode out of Elk Ridge without looking back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. Whatever waited ahead, isolation, hardship, 3 men she barely knew, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The ride-up was easier this time. She knew the trail, now knew where the switchbacks grew treacherous and where the path widened enough to breathe. Molly moved confidently beneath her. The sun warmed Clara's back and the air smelled of pine and snowmelt, and something she could not name but would later understand was freedom. She reached the cabin by early afternoon. Silas was the first to see her coming across the meadow. He let out a whistle and called to his brothers, and by the time Clara dismounted at the porch, all three Kincaids were there. Emmett took Molly's reins without a word, the faintest nod. That was all. Silas grinned broadly. "Welcome to the mountain, Miss Whitfield." Josiah stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. But when Clara met his eyes, something in them had shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of hostility which from Josiah Kincaid was practically an embrace. "I'll show you inside," Silas said. Emmett rearranged things this morning. The sleeping arrangement was characteristic of Emmett's directness. Clara would take the curtained area at the back of the cabin, the only private space in the single room. The three brothers would share the stable loft, an arrangement that sacrificed their comfort entirely for her privacy. "You'll sleep here," Emmett said, indicating the curtained area. "We'll take the loft. It's not proper for us to share quarters, and I won't have you sleeping out there with the animals." "That's your space," Clara protested. "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will." Emmett's tone did not invite negotiation. "Rule 1 up here, we treat each other with respect and honesty. Rule 2, we work hard and pull our weight. Rule 3, we mind our own business and let the town gossip itself to death without our help." "Those are good rules," Clara said quietly. "They'll do." And so began the strangest, most peaceful, most transformative weeks of Clara Whitfield's life. The work was hard. Harder than anything Clara had done in Boston, harder than the boarding house laundry and the restaurant kitchens in the seamstress's back room combined. Water had to be hauled from the spring, 100 yards from the cabin, carried in wooden buckets that made her arms burn and her shoulders ache. The fire needed constant tending, the right wood chosen for the right purpose. Dry pine for quick cooking, heat green oak for slow overnight warmth. The garden behind the cabin demanded weeding and watering and protection from the deer that appeared at dawn like gentle thieves. The horses needed feeding and grooming and exercising. The cabin itself required sweeping and scrubbing, a constant war against dust and pine needles, and the persistent encroachment of the wilderness that pressed against every wall. Clara's hands, already roughened from her weeks of desperate odd jobs, grew harder still. Her shoulders strengthened. Her back learned to carry weight without complaint. She fell into bed each night exhausted in a way that felt clean and earned and honest, and she slept without dreaming. Each brother taught her differently, and in teaching her, they revealed themselves. Emmett taught survival. How to read the sky for approaching storms. How to recognize the warning cry of jays that meant a predator was near. How to listen for the silence that preceded danger. Because when the birds stopped singing, it meant something had scared them, and whatever scared them could kill you. He was patient in his instruction, but economical, with words demonstrating rather than explaining, correcting her mistakes with a gesture or a glance rather than criticism. Clara learned to read Emmett the way he taught her to read the mountain. The tension in his shoulders meant worry. The set of his jaw meant memories. The rare moments when his amber eyes softened, usually when he thought no one was watching, meant that somewhere beneath the granite there was still warmth, still feeling, still the man he had been before whatever terrible thing had turned him to stone. She noticed the burn scar on his left forearm every time his sleeve rode up during work. Puckered, faded, the kind of scar left by fire that had been too close and too hot. He never mentioned it. She never asked. But the scar was a question that hung in the air between them, growing louder with each passing day. Silas taught the domestic arts of mountain life, how to cook with limited ingredients and improvised equipment to make meals that were more than sustenance, that carried warmth and care in every bite, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the brutal winters when the trail became impassable and the cabin was an island in a sea of snow, how to tend the horses, reading their moods and needs the way you'd read a friend. Silas was warm and patient and told stories while they worked. Stories about the wildlife, the migration patterns of elk, the territories of the wolf packs, the golden eagles that nested on cliffs so high you needed a telescope to see them. Silas mentioned their parents once casually in passing. Mother dead of fever. Father killed in a logging accident. 3 brothers alone in the world before they were really old enough to be alone. He mentioned Nessa once too, referring to before the fire, and then went quiet in a way that told Clara the subject was a wound still bleeding after 6 years. She filed the name away, a piece of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. Josiah taught Clara things she never expected to learn. After 2 weeks of watching her struggle to carry water buckets that pulled her off balance with every step, Josiah appeared at the spring one morning and wordlessly took the bucket from her hands. When she protested, he fixed her with a look of pure exasperation. "You'll wreck your back carrying it wrong, watch." He showed her how to distribute the weight, how to use her legs instead of her back, how to balance her small frame against burdens that outweighed her. Then grudgingly, as if the very concept offended some fundamental part of him, he taught her to shoot. He handed her an old Winchester rifle and showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. Clara misted wildly for the first hour. Josiah said nothing. He simply reloaded the rifle and handed it back. By the end of the second hour, Clara could hit a target at 50 yards. By the end of the first week of practice, she could hit it at 100. "Not bad," Josiah said. And from the youngest Kincaid brother, those two words were worth more than any standing ovation Clara had ever imagined. Then quieter, not looking at her, his green gold eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "You should be able to protect yourself up here. We can't always be within shouting distance." It was the first time Josiah had acknowledged Clara as someone worth protecting, someone who belonged in the circle of people he cared about, however grudgingly, however reluctantly. Clara felt the significance of it settle into her bones like warmth from a fire on a cold night. But it was the reading lessons that changed everything. One evening, 3 weeks into Clara's time at the cabin, she was reading by firelight. Tennyson, one of the dozens of volumes from Emmett's shelves. The cabin was quiet. Emmett was outside checking the horses. Silas had retired early with a headache. The fire popped and crackled and threw dancing shadows on the walls. Josiah sat down heavily in the chair across from Clara. He stared at the book in her hands for a long moment. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he did not want to swallow, but could not bring himself to spit out. "You read," he said finally, not quite a question. "My father was a school teacher," Clara said. "He taught me before I could walk." Josiah was quiet for so long that Clara thought the conversation was over. Then with visible effort, with the kind of courage that had nothing to do with fists or firearms, and everything to do with the terrifying vulnerability of admitting weakness, he spoke. "I can't read, that is. Neither can Silas, not properly. Emmett taught himself from those books, spent years puzzling out the words by firelight. But the rest of us never learned. Our pa said hands were more useful than letters." Clara set down the book. She looked at Josiah, at this fierce, suspicious, quick-tempered young man who had spent weeks barely tolerating her presence, and she saw what it had cost him to say those words. The pride he had swallowed. The armor he had laid down. "I could teach you," she offered gently, "if you wanted." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, she was certain he would refuse, that the pride which kept him armored against the world would reassert itself, and the moment would pass. "Don't tell Silas," he said roughly. "He'll never let me hear the end of it," Wayne Clara promised. And that night, by firelight, with the wind moving through the pines outside and the embers glowing low, she began teaching Josiah Kincaid to read. His hands were enormous around the pen she fashioned from a sharpened stick and ink made from soot and water. His brow furrowed with concentration that bordered on pain. He formed letters like a man laying bricks one at a time with deliberate and agonizing care. He struggled. He cursed under his breath. He wanted to throw the pen against the wall more than once. But he did not quit, and Clara did not let him. Night after night, they sat together after the others had gone to the loft. Night after night, Josiah's letters grew stronger, his words more certain, his confidence building syllable by syllable. It was a secret that bound them, a private bridge between two people who had seemed to have nothing in common. And it was the beginning of something Clara had not expected to find on this mountain. Not just trust, but family. The cabin changed with Clara in it. Not in dramatic ways, but in the accumulation of small things that taken together amounted to a transformation. Wildflowers appeared on the table gathered from the meadow during her morning walks. Curtains she sewed from spare fabric softened the cabin's bare windows. The smell of fresh bread replaced the bachelor austerity of cold biscuits and jerky. Silas noticed openly and approved loudly. "Miss Whitfield, if I'd known bread could taste like this, I'd have ridden to Boston to fetch you myself." Josiah said nothing about the changes, but ate 3 full servings of Clara's venison stew without complaint, which was commentary enough. Emmett noticed in his own home which was to say he noticed everything and spoke of nothing. But Clara saw him pause at the wildflowers she had placed on his table. She saw his hand hover above the petals without touching them, his face unreadable, his amber eyes holding an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not pain exactly, something adjacent to pain. The particular ache of a man who had forgotten what beauty looked like inside his own home and was remembering now and finding the remembering harder than the forgetting. Clara understood then without being told that someone had put flowers on this table before. Someone who was gone. And the ghost of that someone was present in every careful inch of distance Emmett maintained between himself and Clara, in every conversation that approached the personal, and then veered away in every glance that lasted a heartbeat too long before he looked away as if burned. But she did not push. She had learned patience from her mother, who waited 10 years for a life that never improved. She had learned that trust could not be demanded or hurried or forced. It could only be offered consistently and without condition, and then you waited to see if the other person was brave enough to accept it. So Clara offered. She offered competence and warmth and quiet companionship and asked for nothing in return. She made coffee in the morning and left it where Emmett would find it. She mended his shirts without being asked, matching her stitches to the fabric so carefully that you couldn't tell where the repair began. She sat with him on evenings when the others had gone to the loft and said nothing, simply sharing the fire and the silence, letting him know through her presence that solitude was a choice, not a sentence. And slowly, inch by careful inch, Emmett Kincaid began to let her in. It started with the books. He would leave one open on the table, a passage marked with a strip of leather, and Clara would read it, and they would discuss it the next morning over coffee. Short conversations, at first 3 or 4 sentences, before he retreated back behind his walls. But the sentences grew longer. The retreats grew shorter. And one morning, in the middle of a discussion about a Tennyson poem that had clearly meant something to him for a very long time, Emmett laughed. It was a small sound, rough and rusty from disuse, like a door opening that had been shut for years. But it was real. And when Clara looked at him in surprise, she saw something in his amber eyes that made her chest ache with a feeling she was not yet ready to name. He stopped laughing, his face closed. He stood and walked out of the cabin without a word. But that night he left another book open on the table. And the next morning over coffee, they talked a little longer. The first month passed, then the second. Spring deepened into early summer. Snow vanished from all but the highest peaks, and the meadow around the cabin exploded with wildflowers in colors Clara had never imagined possible. Purple and gold, and orange and red, spreading across the mountain landscape like an artist's palette, overturned by a careless hand. The creek behind the cabin ran high with snowmelt, clear and cold, tasting of stone and skipun. Clara planted a garden, beans and squash potatoes and onions, the same vegetables her mother had grown in window boxes in Boston, now given real soil and real sun and space to spread. She learned to make bread in the Dutch oven. She learned to cure hides and render fat and make soap from lionish and ash. She learned the mountain in the way you learn a language, word by word, sound by sound, until one day you realize you are thinking in it. The brothers fell into rhythms around her. Emmett would rise before dawn, check trap lines, or hunt return with game that Clara would process and cook. Silas would handle the horses and the maintenance, and the trips to town for supplies that Clara no longer made because the town had become hostile territory. Josiah would split wood and haul water and patrol the perimeter of their land with the restless vigilance of a young wolf. And in the evenings, in the golden hour before dark, they would sit together on the porch and watch the light leave the mountains. 4 people who had each in their own way been discarded by the world. 4 people who were building something none of them had expected and none of them could yet name. Clara's hands grew strong, her face bronzed from sun and wind, her body thin from weeks of near starvation filled out with proper meals. She wore the split skirt she had sewn from fabric Emmett provided without explanation, and a work shirt that had belonged to Silas before he decided it fit Clara better. She was changing, not just physically, but in some essential way that went deeper than muscle and bone. She was becoming someone she had never been in Boston, someone capable and confident and useful, someone who mattered, whose absence would be felt, whose presence made a difference in the daily functioning of this small, isolated, improbable household. She was becoming, she realized one morning, as she stood at the spring with a water bucket balanced perfectly on each hip, someone she actually liked being. The mountain was making her. and she was making the mountain feel for the first time in 6 years like a home. But what she did not yet know, what she could not yet see, because the brothers had walled it away behind silence and grief and 6 years of careful concealment, was the truth about why Emmett Kincaid woke screaming in the night. The truth about a woman named Nessa and a fire that was not an accident. The truth about Cordelia Pruitt and the secret she had been protecting since the night her husband arranged a murder and called it fate. That truth was coming. And when it arrived, it would change everything. The screaming woke her at 2 in the morning, not words, not language, just raw, agonized sound that tore through the cabin walls from the stable loft like something being ripped apart from the inside. Clara lay rigid in her curtained sleeping area, heart hammering, listening as the screaming dissolved into ragged breathing and then into a silence that was somehow worse than the sound that preceded it. In the morning, no one mentioned it. Emmett's eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight, his movements carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had fought a battle in his sleep and lost. Silas made coffee with extra care. Josiah chopped wood with a fury that suggested he was killing something other than timber. Clara said nothing. She watched and waited and filed the information away alongside the burn scar and the name Nessa, and the way Cordelia Pruitt's name made all three brothers go still as stone. A week later, it happened again. This time, Clara did not stay in bed. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, crossed the moonlit yard, and climbed the ladder to the stable loft. The horses stirred below her, curious but calm. Silas and Josiah's bedrolls were empty. They had learned long ago, Clara realized, to find somewhere else to be when their brother's nightmares came. Emmett sat on his blankets with his back against the wall, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he was trying to silence. The lantern cast wavering shadows across his face, and in that unstable light, Clara saw the man behind the mountain. Not the stone, not the fortress, just a man broken and grieving and desperately, terribly alone. Emmett. Her voice was soft. He looked up. His face was wrecked. Every defense stripped, every wall demolished. His amber eyes were red-rimmed and wild, and full of a pain so old and deep, it had become part of him, woven into his bones like mineral into rock. "I'm fine," he said. The lie was so transparent, it was almost merciful. Clara sat on the loft floor, leaving space between them, close enough to reach, far enough to retreat. "You don't have to talk about it, but you don't have to carry it alone either." Emmett stared at her for a long moment. She could see the war inside him, the part that wanted to speak fighting the part that had survived by staying silent, the part that wanted to trust battling the part that knew what trust had cost him the last time he opened his hands and let someone in. When he began to speak, his voice was barely recognizable. Raw, rough, scraped down to something almost whispered. He told her about Nessa. She was a trapper's daughter, he said, strong and laughing and fearless. Hair the color of autumn leaves. Hands that could skin a rabbit and play a fiddle and hold a man's face with a tenderness that made the whole brutal world feel bearable. They built this cabin together, board by board, nail by nail, dreaming of the family they would raise. Children with her laughter and his stubbornness. A ranch that would grow with the years. A life. Emmett left one morning to check trap lines 30 miles north. Expected to be gone 3 days. He came back to find the cabin burning. Flames so high they lit the mountain like a false dawn. He ran into the fire. The scar on his forearm was where the burning door frame collapsed onto his arm as he tried to reach her. He did not reach her. He was too late by hours, maybe more. The heat drove him back, and he fell in the yard and watched his whole world burn to ash and ember. "They called it an accident," Emmett said, his voice hollow as a drum. "Stove fire that spread. But I built that stove with my own hands. It was sound. And Nessa knew fire better than most men. She'd been tending flames since she could walk." Clara's breath caught. "You don't think it was an accident?" Emmett's hands clenched in the blanket beneath him. "There was a man named Walter Pruitt, owned the copper mine, wanted this land, the timber rights, the mineral claims underneath. I refused to sell, refused 3 times. He did not finish. He did not need to." Clara heard what his silence said. Nessa paid the price for his refusal. The sheriff was in Pruitt's pocket then, same as now. Filed it as accidental. Case closed. Emmett reached inside his shirt and pulled out a leather cord. A small brass key hung from it, catching the lantern light. I have a locked box under the floorboards. Inside is a letter, half burned, found in the ashes, from Walter Pruitt to a man named Jennings, arranging payment for clearing the Kincaid claim. The letter doesn't say arson, but it's the closest thing to proof I've ever had. Why haven't you used it? Against who? His laugh was bitter, a sound with no humor in it at all. Walter's dead, fell down a mine shaft 2 years later. Jennings disappeared. The sheriff won't investigate. And Cordelia controls the judges and the lawyers and everything else. Who'd believe 3 mountain men over the most powerful family in the territory? Clara reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and scarred and trembling. He flinched at the contact, the involuntary recoil of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by someone who meant no harm. Then slowly his grip tightened around hers. I believe you, Clara said. 3 words, simple and quiet and entirely sincere. Emmett Kincaid bowed his head, and the man who had not wept in front of another living soul in 6 years let the tears come. Clara held his hand in the lantern light while the horses breathed below and the mountain held its silence. She did not try to fix what was broken. She did not offer platitudes or promises. She simply stayed her small hand in his large one and let him know that carrying grief did not require carrying it alone. When his breathing finally steadied, Emmett looked at her with eyes that had been scoured clean by tears and said quietly, harder things have been survived. Clara recognized her own words spoken back to her. She had said them once weeks ago when a supply delivery had gone wrong and a bag of flour had split on the trail, and she had sat down in the dirt and wanted to cry over something so small and so final. Emmett had been there. He had heard her whisper those words to herself, and he had remembered. Yes, Clara said. They have. Neither of them spoke again. But when Clara finally descended the ladder and crossed the yard back to the cabin, she felt something fundamental had shifted between them. A wall had come down, a door had opened, and whatever lay on the other side, there was no closing it now. 6 weeks after Clara arrived at the cabin, she and Silas rode down to Elk Ridge for supplies. It was her first time in town since moving to the mountain, and she felt the change in herself with every step of Molly's hooves on the familiar trail. She was stronger. Her movements were assured. She wore the split skirt she had made from fabric Emmett provided, and a sturdy work shirt and her mother's cameo at her throat. Her skin was lightly bronzed from weeks of mountain sun, and her hands bore the calluses of honest labor. Silas rode beside her, easy in the saddle, telling her stories about a family of foxes denning near the creek crossing. His warmth was a comfort against the anxiety tightening her stomach as the town came into view. Clara had hoped 6 weeks of absence might have dulled the town's interest in her. She had hoped wrong. The whispers started before she reached the general store. Eyes followed her down Main Street with the particular intensity of people watching a scandal walk past in broad daylight. Cordelia Pruitt's poison had done its work thoroughly. Clara Whitfield discarded mail-order bride, now living with 3 unmarried mountain men. The story had grown in the telling, as stories always do in small towns, each retelling adding details that never happened, and removing context that might have made the truth boring enough to ignore. Silas went to Harding's for the supply order. Clara crossed the street to pick up thread and needles from a smaller shop. She never reached it. Cordelia Pruitt stepped into her path like a gate swinging shut. 3 other women flanked her, forming a wall of silk and judgment and calculated cruelty. The Kincaid brothers' little pet has come down from the mountain, Cordelia said, her voice pitched to Carrie. Tell me, dear, 3 men and 1 woman. The arrangements must be fascinating. Clara kept walking, or tried to. I had a position for you, you know. Cordelia's voice sharpened. A proper position, in my own household, supervised, respectable. I even spoke to Harlan about directing you to me when he was finished with you. But you chose those animals instead. Clara stopped. The words sank in like stones into still water. Cordelia had spoken to Harlan, had directed him, had arranged for Clara to be rejected not because Harlan lost interest, but because Cordelia wanted Clara desperate enough to accept servitude in the Pruitt household. The entire thing had been orchestrated from the beginning. You, Clara whispered, you knew he was going to reject me. You wanted me with nothing. Cordelia's smile did not waver. I wanted to offer you charity, dear. Instead, you chose to debase yourself. What happened next was swift and vicious. Cordelia's hand shot out and seized the cameo at Clara's throat. The pin tore through fabric as the brooch was ripped away. Clara gasped and reached for it, but Mrs. Finch grabbed her arm. A third woman seized the other side of her dress. "This is what happens," Cordelia said, her voice cold and precise, "to women who forget their place." They tore her dress apart in the middle of Main Street, the navy blue dress she had made by candlelight while her mother lay dying, the only piece of her old life she had carried across a continent. It ripped at the seams, the bodice tearing away from the skirt buttons, scattering across the dirt like seeds that would never grow. White cotton undergarments exposed, hair tumbling loose. Clara's mother's cameo lying in the dust. The town watched. No one helped. No one spoke. The silence of complicity, which is the loudest silence of all. Levi Briggs broke through the crowd and threw his coat around Clara's shoulders. 12 years old, barefoot, braver than every adult on that street. Clara dropped to her knees. Her fingers found the cameo in the dirt, closed around it, held it against her racing heart. She locked her jaw and swallowed every tear. She would not give Cordelia Pruitt that victory. Then the hooves. Silas had gone looking for Clara when she did not return to Harding's store. He found the scene and rode for his brothers. How they arrived so quickly, Clara would never fully understand. Perhaps they had already been riding toward town. Perhaps the mountain itself had sent them. The Kincaid brothers came off their horses before the animals had fully stopped, boots hitting dirt in near unison, and walked through the crowd with the kind of deliberate calm that is more terrifying than rage. Emmett reached Clara first. Without a word, he removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her enormous against her small frame. Then he turned to Cordelia Pruitt, and his voice when he spoke was quiet enough to make every person on that street lean forward to hear. "That's enough." Cordelia took a step backward, but her pride would not let her retreat entirely. "This is none of your concern, Kincaid. This woman is under my protection." Emmett's amber eyes locked onto Cordelia's face with the focused intensity of a rifle being aimed. "Touch her again, any of you, and I will burn your world to the ground the same way your husband burned mine." The accusation detonated in the silence like dynamite in a mine shaft. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cordelia's face drained of all color. Josiah flanked Clara's right side, fists clenched, vibrating with the effort of not hitting something. Silas took her left, his usual warmth replaced by something as hard and cold as the granite peaks above them. "We're leaving," Emmett said. He placed his hand on Clara's back, gentle as a prayer, and guided her toward the horses. 3 mountain men surrounding one small woman, shielding her from the crowd's gaze like a living fortress. They rode out of Elk Ridge in formation, Emmett and Silas flanking Clara, Josiah at the rear, his hand never straying far from his rifle. No one followed. 2 weeks later, the town came to them. 4 riders appeared at the edge of the meadow in the hard light of early morning. Harlan Marsh sat his horse with obvious discomfort, flanked by Sheriff Claude Denton and 2 deputies. The sheriff wore the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. The deputies rested their hands on their gun belts in a way that tried to look casual and failed. Emmett stepped onto the porch with his rifle cradled in his arm, not aimed, just present. Silas emerged from the stable. Josiah materialized from the tree line, his own weapon already in hand. "Marsh," Emmett said, "long ride from your store." Harlan's pinched face was purple with righteous indignation that sat poorly on features designed for calculation. "I'm here regarding Miss Whitfield's welfare. As the man who arranged her passage to Wyoming, I have a responsibility to ensure—" "You have nothing." Clara stepped out from behind the garden fence. She had heard the horses and come running, and now she stood in her split skirt and work shirt with dirt on her hands and steel in her voice. "You rejected me, Mr. Marsh. Your responsibility ended the moment I stepped off that stagecoach." Sheriff Denton cleared his throat. "Miss Whitfield, we've received complaints. Multiple concerned citizens believe your moral welfare is at risk. An unmarried woman living with 3 unmarried men—" "She's here of her own free will," Silas said firmly. "Paid fair wages. Given private quarters separate from ours. Nothing improper." "Concerned citizens." Josiah's voice dripped acid. "You mean Cordelia Pruitt, the woman who tore this girl's clothes off in the street?" One of the deputies, a hard-faced man with cruel eyes, sneered from his saddle. "Come on. 1 woman, 3 men. We all know what's happening up here. Pretty little thing like her. Only one reason 3 men keep a woman around. Josiah moved before anyone could stop him. His rifle hit the ground and his fist connected with the deputy's jaw with a sound like an axe striking hardwood. The man toppled from his horse. Josiah was on him in an instant, one hand fisted in the man's shirt. "Say one more word about her," Josiah whispered, his voice terrifyingly calm, "and they'll carry you down this mountain." "Josiah," Emmett's voice was steel cable. "Let him go." Josiah held the man for one more heartbeat. Then he released him and stood chest-heaving, knuckles bloody. The sheriff had his weapon drawn. The remaining deputy's hand was on his gun. Harlan looked like he might be sick. The air crackled with violence so close to the surface you could feel its heat. And then Emmett spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Then I'll marry her." Absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows a lightning strike before the thunder reaches you. "I'll marry Clara Whitfield," Emmett continued, his voice steady as bedrock. "Make it legal. Make it proper. My name, my protection, my standing before the law. That solve your moral concerns, Sheriff." Clara's heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone on that mountain could hear it. She stared at Emmett, trying to read his face, trying to understand what he was offering. A legal shield. A wall of respectability built from a marriage license, and a name that the law would recognize, even if the town would not. Clara Whitfield. Emmett's amber eyes found hers. "Will you marry me?" Clara saw everything in that moment. The life she would be choosing and the life she would be leaving behind. The man before her, grieving and guarded and capable of tenderness so fierce it terrified him. The mountain that had become her home. The brothers who had become her family. "Yes," she said, clear and strong and certain. "I'll marry you." Emmett nodded once. Turned back to the sheriff. "Problem solved. Now get off my property. All of you." They left. The deputy Josiah struck, clutched his jaw, and shot murderous looks over his shoulder until the tree swallowed him. When the sound of hooves faded to nothing, the 4 of them stood in the meadow, and the silence that settled was a different kind entirely. Not hostile, not charged, just stunned. Silas exhaled slowly. "Well, that happened." Josiah stared at his eldest brother. "Did you just propose marriage during a standoff?" Emmett looked at Clara. She looked back. And despite everything, despite the fear and the absurdity and the weight of what they had just agreed to, something passed between them that was very close to the beginning of a smile. They rode to town the next morning, all 4 together. Reverend Judson Price performed the ceremony in his cluttered sitting room that smelled of coffee and old books. The Reverend was thoughtful and careful, and he asked both of them questions that deserved honest answers. "Are you certain you can give this woman what she deserves?" he asked Emmett. "I can give her respect, protection, a home where she belongs. I don't know about love, but I'm willing to try. A man keeps his word, Reverend, and I'm giving mine." "That's the best any of us can offer," the Reverend said quietly and opened his Bible. The ceremony was brief, vows spoken in steady voices. When Reverend Price said, "You may kiss your bride," Emmett leaned down and pressed a soft, brief kiss to Clara's forehead, tender but restrained. The kiss of a man keeping a promise he was not sure how to keep. They stepped outside into bright sunshine, and Cordelia Pruitt was waiting. "Married," Cordelia said, her voice dripping with contempt. "How convenient. Though when a man is desperate enough for female company—" Emmett interrupted with words that fell like hammer blows. "My wife is worth 10 of you, Cordelia. She has more courage in her smallest finger than you've carried in your entire life. You targeted her because she was vulnerable, because hurting people who can't fight back is the only power you've ever had. Your husband burned my home and killed the woman I loved, and you've spent 6 years making sure no one ever asked the right questions about how he built your fortune." The crowd that had gathered went still as death. Josiah stepped forward. "Clara Kincaid is family. You speak against her, you look at her wrong, you answer to us, all 3 of us." Cordelia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. For the first time in anyone's memory, the woman who had ruled this town through fear and cruelty had nothing to say. Emmett took Clara's hand. They walked to the horses. Behind them, silence broke into a storm of whispers that would reshape Elk Ridge from the ground up. "You're home now," Silas said quietly as they rode out of town, the morning sun warm on their backs and the mountains rising ahead like a promise that had finally been kept. The marriage began in the uncertain space between arrangement and reality. Back at the cabin, Emmett moved his bedroll from the stable loft to the cabin floor. Not sharing Clara's bed, not yet, but no longer sleeping apart from her. The gesture mattered more than words. 2 weeks passed in careful, quiet discovery. Clara and Emmett talked, really talked, about their past, their losses, their fears. Silas and Josiah became brothers to Clara in ways that went beyond legal definition. The reading lessons continued openly now. Josiah no longer cared who knew. Then Clara found the letter. She was reorganizing the bookshelves when a folded paper slipped from between the pages of a novel. Not the burned letter from Pruitt. Something else entirely. A mail-order bride advertisement written in Emmett's careful hand dated 4 years earlier. Seeking wife for Mountain Homestead. Must be small of frame, fair-haired, literate. The description matched Clara as if she had been drawn from memory rather than imagination. Clara went cold. Had Harding known about this advertisement? Had Emmett? Had the whole arrangement, the delivery job, the offer of employment, the proposal been engineered from the beginning? Was she a replacement, ordered from a catalog, selected because she matched a dead woman's description? She confronted Emmett by the fireplace that evening, the advertisement in her trembling hand. His face went pale. Not with guilt, with recognition. The recognition of a man watching a fear he had buried climb out of its grave. 2 years after Nessa died, he said slowly, Silas convinced me to try while I wrote that advertisement. Describe what I thought I wanted. Then I realized what I'd actually described was Nessa. Small, fair-haired, could read. I was trying to replace her with a stranger, and that wasn't fair to anyone. So I tore it up, or thought I had. But I matched that description, Clara said. Exactly. You match words I wrote on paper 4 years ago. But you're not those words. You're not Nessa. Emmett's voice roughened. You rode up a mountain alone because you were brave enough when the rest of this territory was too cowardly. You stood in front of Cordelia Pruitt and didn't break. You sat with me in a stable loft while I fell apart and you didn't flinch. You taught my brother to read. You are not a replacement for anyone, Clara. You are entirely and completely yourself, and I did not know I needed you until you were already here. Clara wanted to believe him, but trust once cracked requires time to seal. That night, she pulled the curtain closed. Emmett lay on the floor on the other side, silent. The distance between them, a few feet of fabric, felt like the width of a canyon. In the morning, Josiah found Clara at the spring. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he spoke more words than Clara had heard him say in any single conversation since she arrived. You know why he tore that advertisement up? Because he described Nessa, small and fair and bookish. And when he read it back, he felt sick. Because he knew finding someone who looked like her wouldn't bring her back. It would just mean he was using some other woman's life to paper over the hole in his own. But I look like that description, Clara said quietly. Josiah drove his axe into a stump with enough force to bury the blade 3 inches deep. He turned to face her, and for the first time there were no barriers in his green-gold eyes. You look like a description written on paper. But you're not those words. Nessa never stood up to Cordelia Pruitt. Nessa never rode a mountain trail alone. Nessa wouldn't have sat in a stable loft teaching a stubborn fool like me to read until midnight without a single complaint. His voice dropped. You are Clara, and Emmett loves you, not the description, not the ghost, you. I see it every day, even if he's too scared to say it. It was the longest speech Josiah had ever given, and it broke the dam. Clara walked into the cabin. Emmett stood by the cold fireplace, his back to her, his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man waiting for a verdict. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go, Clara said. Emmett turned. His amber eyes were raw. I'm staying because everywhere else is nowhere without you. He crossed the room in 2 strides. His hands found her face calloused and gentle, and he kissed her. Not the chaste press of lips from the ceremony, a real kiss, deep and searching, full of 6 years of loneliness, breaking apart in something new and terrifying and magnificent growing in its place. When they broke apart, foreheads touching, breathing unsteady, Emmett whispered, I'm falling in love with you. Not the way I loved Nessa. Different. Grown from watching you survive everything this world threw at you and still find a way to put flowers on my table. Clara cupped his face in her hands. I've been falling in love with you since the night you trusted me with the worst thing that ever happened to you, since you let me stay. That night, the cabin door closed softly. Outside, the first snow of early winter began to fall, dusting the meadow in white, transforming the world into something clean and new and full of the quiet promise that comes when two people choose each other, not because they have to, but because they want to. Because they are braver together than they ever were apart. Because love, when it is earned, is stronger than love that is given freely, the way a house built by hand is stronger than one you simply walk into. When morning came, everything had changed between them. The weeks that followed were the most peaceful Clara had ever known. Winter deepened across the mountains, burying the meadow in white, sealing the cabin inside a world of snow and silence. The trail became impassable. The four of them were an island cut off from everything below, and Clara discovered that isolation, when shared with the right people, is not loneliness at all, but sanctuary. Emmett was different now. The stone had not disappeared, but it had cracked open, and what grew through the cracks was tenderness so careful and deliberate it made Clara's throat ache. He woke her each morning with coffee and a kiss pressed to her forehead, the same gesture from their wedding ceremony, but warmer now, softer, carrying a weight of feeling that grew heavier with each passing day. He still did not say the words easily. I love you came from Emmett, the way spring came to the mountains, slowly, reluctantly arriving only after a long winter of waiting. But Clara did not need the words. She read them in the way he left a book open on the table each night, in the way his hand found the small of her back when she stood beside him at the fire, in the way he built a rocking chair without being asked and placed it by the window where the morning light fell warmest. Clara read the charred letter from Pruitt one quiet afternoon while Emmett was checking trap lines. She had seen the locked box under the floorboards, had watched Emmett open it twice with the brass key around his neck, each time putting the letter back without showing her. But they were married now, and secrets within a marriage are stones that grow heavier with time. She lifted the floorboard carefully. The iron box was small, rusted at the corners. Inside the letter was fragile, its edges black and curling the paper so brittle she was afraid to breathe on it. She read it slowly, her schoolteacher's daughter's eye-catching details that the Kincaid brothers, for all their mountain intelligence, had not been trained to see. The letter referenced a specific date, a specific payment, $200 sent through a bank in Denver, and most critically, it referenced a second letter sent to the territorial marshal's office as insurance against future disputes. Clara sat on the cabin floor holding a dead man's words and feeling the shape of justice taking form in her hands. If there was a bank record of that payment, if there was a copy of this letter in the marshal's files, then there was a trail, a paper trail that not even Cordelia Pruitt's influence could erase. When Emmett returned, Clara showed him what she had found. His face went through several changes as she explained, moving from the familiar pain of remembering to something new and unfamiliar. Hope, perhaps, or the dangerous cousin of hope that lives next door to it and answers to the name of reckoning. After 6 years, Emmett said quietly, after 6 years there might actually be proof. They composed a letter to the territorial marshal together that evening, Clara's education and Emmett's knowledge of the facts combining into something neither could have written alone. Silas wrote it down to Harding, who agreed to send it through a trusted connection in a neighboring town far from Cordelia Pruitt's network of allies and informants. The letter went out into the winter world, and they waited. It was late in the winter, deep in the short, dark days of February, when Clara realized her monthly courses were late. She waited a week, then 2. Hope and terror braided together inside her like rope, each strand making the other stronger. By the 3rd week, she was certain. She was standing in the garden, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, staring at the snow-covered furrows where beans would grow in spring when Emmett came around the corner of the cabin, carrying an armload of firewood. He took one look at her face and dropped every log. They hit the frozen ground and rolled, and he was beside her in 3 strides, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "Nothing's wrong." Clara's voice trembled with something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears. "Emmett, I think I'm going to have a baby." The color drained from his face as completely and swiftly as if someone had opened a valve and let it run out onto the snow. She watched the memories crash over him. Nessa, the fire, the life that was supposed to come after and never did. Every nightmare he had ever screamed through came flooding back into his waking eyes, and for a terrible moment Clara thought he might break. Emmett, she gripped his arms. Look at me. I am not Nessa. I'm strong. I'm healthy. Dr. Hale is in town. We will prepare. We will do everything right. You don't know. His voice was barely a whisper. Women die out here, Clara, without proper help, without a hospital. Then we will get proper help. We will go to town when the time comes. We will hire the best midwife in the territory. And you will be beside me through every moment of it because a man keeps his word and you promised me a home where I belong. This child belongs here too. Emmett dropped to his knees in the snow. He pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her hips, and he held her with the desperate strength of a man gripping the only solid thing in a world that kept crumbling beneath him. Don't leave me, he whispered. Either of you. Please don't leave me. Clara's hands found his hair tangling in the chestnut strands, and she held his head against her body and felt the tremors running through him, and made a promise she intended to keep with every fiber of her being. We won't. I promise, Emmett. Winter always ends, and spring is coming. Silas, when told, reacted with uncomplicated joy that flooded the cabin like sunlight after rain. He picked Clara up and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing and begging him to put her down. Josiah went quiet. He stood very still for a long moment, his green gold eyes bright with something he would never have admitted was emotion. Then he walked out of the cabin without a word. The next morning, a beautifully carved wooden rattle sat on the kitchen table, sanded smooth as silk. No one mentioned where it came from. No one needed to. Monthly trips to Elk Ridge continued through the winter, the brothers taking turns accompanying Clara to see Dr. Warren Hale, a young physician who had arrived in town the previous summer. He examined Clara thoroughly each visit, pronouncing her healthy and strong, the pregnancy progressing normally. He taught Emmett how to time contractions, how to check Clara's pulse, how to recognize signs of trouble. Emmett absorbed every word with the intensity of a man memorizing scripture. The town had changed, not entirely, not overnight, but visibly, undeniably. Emmett's public accusation against the Pruitt family had cracked something open in Elk Ridge the way a single stone can crack a dam and let the water through. Women who had been silent for years began to speak. The mayor's wife, a quiet woman named Margaret Hadley, visited Clara during one supply run and delivered an apology that had clearly cost her sleep to compose. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Margaret said, her eyes direct and unblinking, for not speaking up sooner, for letting Cordelia terrorize this town. You showed us what courage looks like, Mrs. Kincaid. I wish it hadn't taken watching a woman be stripped in the street to make us find our spines. Clara accepted the apology with grace she did not entirely feel. Forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, but carrying resentment was heavy work, and she had enough to carry already. In March, a response arrived from the territorial marshal's office. Silas brought it up the mountain along with the supply order, and Clara opened it with hands that shook. The letter confirmed that a copy of the Pruitt correspondence existed in their files. An investigation would be opened. A federal marshal would be dispatched to Elk Ridge when the passes cleared in spring. Clara looked at Emmett, he looked at the letter, and something in his amber eyes changed, shifted, rearranged itself like tectonic plates deep underground. Not peace, not yet, but the first tremor that precedes it. Harder things have been survived, he said quietly. And this time the words sounded different, not like an endurance, like a beginning. The blizzard came in early April, 2 weeks before Clara's expected delivery date, and 3 weeks before the mountain passes would normally clear. It arrived without warning, the sky turning from blue to iron gray in less than an hour, the temperature plummeting, the wind rising to a howl that shook the cabin walls and drove snow sideways through every crack and gap. And Clara's labor began. The first contraction doubled her over at the kitchen table, a band of pressure that tightened around her middle and squeezed until she could not breathe. She gripped the table edge and waited for it to pass, counting seconds the way Dr. Hale had taught her. Emmett, she said his name calmly, deliberately, the way you call someone back from a long distance. It's time. He was at her side before the words were fully spoken. His face went white. She saw the nightmares rise behind his eyes like creatures surfacing from deep water. Nessa trapped behind a wall of flame, the burning door frame collapsing onto his arm, the heat driving him back while the woman he loved died in the place they had built together. For one heartbeat, maybe two, he froze. Emmett, Clara's voice cut through his paralysis with the precision of a blade. Look at me, I need you here, not in the past, here, with me. Emmett took a breath, then another, his jaw set, his shoulders squared, and the man Clara needed him to be stepped forward while the man who was afraid stepped back but did not leave. Silas, Emmett called, his voice steady now. Boil water. All of it. Get it, every clean cloth we have. Silas moved with purpose, his warmth channeled into action, his hands sure as he stoked the fire and filled every pot. Josiah took his position by the door, rifle in hand, his role simple and absolute. Nothing came through that door, not the storm. Not the wolves that howled closer in bad weather. Nothing. The labor was long. 12 hours of pain and fierce, stubborn determination. Clara paced the cabin, leaning against the walls when contractions hit, breathing through them, the way animals breathe through pain in deep, shuddering gulps that emptied her lungs and filled them again. Emmett stayed at her side. He held her hand through contractions that made her cry out, his own fingers turning white under the pressure of her grip. He wiped sweat from her forehead with cloths Silas kept dampening at the washstand. And he talked to her, not about the storm or the danger or the absence of a doctor, about the future, about teaching their child to ride, about the garden Clara would plant when the snow melted, about the life they were building together one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of stubborn courage at a time. We'll get through this, he murmured against her hair when a particularly brutal contraction left her gasping. We get through everything, that's what we do. There were moments when Clara's strength faltered, when exhaustion pulled her under and the pain became a living thing with teeth and claws and no mercy. When she looked at Emmett through a haze of sweat and tears and said the words he was most afraid of hearing. I can't. Emmett, I can't do this. You can. His voice broke, but it did not waver. You crossed a mountain with nothing but courage and a mule. You survived everything this world threw at you. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Clara Kincaid, and you can do this. We can do this. Stronger together than apart. Remember, stronger together, Clara gasped and bore down again. As dawn broke, as the blizzard finally began to exhaust itself against the mountain, a different cry split the air, high and thin and furious. The sound of a newborn announcing her arrival to the world with the full force of lungs that had never been used and a temper that already suggested Kincaid blood. Clara collapsed back against the pillows Silas had stacked behind her, drenched in sweat, emptied of everything except the most profound exhaustion she had ever experienced. And in her arms, wrapped in the softest cloth they own, was a baby girl, tiny red face screaming with magnificent rage, alive and healthy and breathing. Emmett knelt beside the bed. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely reach out. His face was wet with tears he had stopped trying to hide somewhere around hour 8, and he looked at his daughter with an expression that went beyond wonder, beyond joy, into a place where language had not yet been invented to describe what a man feels when he has been given back something he thought was lost forever. She's perfect, he whispered. She is. Clara said, her voice a thread of sound. What should we name her? Emmett had wrestled with this through every night of Clara's pregnancy. Part of him had wanted to name the baby Nessa to honor the woman who should have had this moment and never did. But that name belonged to the past, and this child was the future. This child was proof that grief does not have to be the end of the story, that love can begin again, different and new in soil that was once nothing but ash. Hope, he said. I want to name her Hope because that's what she is. Everything I thought I'd lost. Everything I didn't dare believe I could have again. Clara's eyes filled. Hope Kincaid. It's perfect. Silas appeared in the doorway, his face split by a grin so wide it seemed to exist in a dimension slightly larger than his face could contain. Behind him, Josiah hovered, arms crossed, jaw tight, trying very hard to look nonchalant and failing so completely that it was almost beautiful. Can we? Silas began. Get in here, Clara said, laughing through tears that would not stop coming. Silas crossed the room and reached out to touch Hope's tiny hand with one enormous finger. His expression was all pure and uncomplicated, the face of a man meeting a miracle for the first time. Josiah hung back until Hope's miniature fist closed around his finger with surprising strength. Something in his face cracked open, then some final wall coming down, and the youngest Kincaid brother looked at his niece with eyes that were very bright and very full. "She's got a grip," Josiah said roughly, not bothering to blink away what was happening to his eyes. "She'll be strong." "She's a Kincaid," Emmett set his arm around Clara, his gaze on his daughter. "Of course she'll be strong." "Built this with our own hands," Silas said softly, looking around the cabin. "4 adults, 1 baby, 1 family. Every bit of it." Spring came to the mountains with the force of resurrection. Snow melted in cascading torrents, and the creek roared with meltwater. Wildflowers erupted across the meadow in waves of purple and gold. The world, which had contracted to the size of a cabin during the long winter, expanded again into something vast and alive. With the spring came the federal marshal. Marshal James Whitaker arrived in Elk Ridge with 2 deputies and a territorial judge. The investigation was swift and thorough. Bank records in Denver confirmed a $200 payment from Walter Pruitt's account to a man named Jennings 3 days before the fire. The marshal's files contained the second letter, which explicitly referenced the removal of the Kincaid obstacle to the Copper Ridge timber claim. Witnesses came forward, people who had seen things 6 years ago and been too afraid to speak. Cordelia Pruitt was arrested for conspiracy and accessory to murder. She did not go quietly. She went screaming, clawing, spitting accusations at everyone within reach. Her carefully constructed facade of gentility shattered beyond repair. The marshal put her in a prison wagon, and the town of Elk Ridge stood on the boardwalks and watched her go, and not one person spoke in her defense. Emmett stood on the boardwalk with Clara beside him, hope cradled in Clara's arms. Tears tracked silently down his face, and he did not wipe them away. "Is it over?" Clara asked softly. "The legal part." His voice was rough. "The grief, the years we lost. That doesn't end with a trial." "No, but maybe now you can remember Nessa with love instead of fury. Maybe now the remembering doesn't have to hurt so much." Emmett pulled Clara close, careful of the baby between them, and rested his chin on top of her head. They stood like that while the prison wagon rolled out of town, while the crowd dispersed, while the dust settled on Main Street, and a new chapter began for a town that had been held hostage by one family's cruelty for far too long. "You're home now," Clara whispered against his chest. "We're all home." 5 years passed like water over stones, smoothing the rough edges and deepening the channels. Hope Kincaid at 5 was a force of nature. Blonde-haired like her mother, amber-eyed like her father, with a stubborn streak that drew equally from both. She rode her first pony before she could properly read, and she could read before most children in Elk Ridge could spell their own names, because her mother was a schoolteacher's daughter and believed that letters were as important as reins. Clara taught Hope at the kitchen table, each morning the same table where she had once taught Josiah. Emmett built a small desk for the child, dovetailed and polished, until it gleamed, placed beside the window where the light fell best. Silas carved a set of alphabet blocks. Josiah, whose own reading had progressed from halting syllables to confident paragraphs, sat with his niece in the evenings and read aloud from the same books that had once defeated him, his deep voice steady and sure, stumbling only rarely now. The cabin expanded, a new room added by the brothers for Hope, with a window that looked out over the mountains. Another room for Clara and Emmett, with a door that closed and privacy that felt earned rather than imposed. The stable grew, the garden doubled. A second horse was added, then a third. The homestead was becoming a ranch, slowly, season by season, built with their own hands. Clara's second child, a boy, arrived on a warm September morning with considerably less drama than his sister. Doctor. Haley made the ride up the mountain this time, arriving 3 days before the birth and staying a week after sleeping in the stable loft that had once housed 3 brothers and their grief. They named the boy William after Clara's father, and Emmett held his son with hands that trembled only slightly, and the trembling was from joy rather than fear. 15 years passed. Hope at 15 was her mother's intelligence and her father's frame, tall for a girl, strong from ranch work, with a laugh that could be heard from the far meadow. She rode better than most men in the territory and read more than any of them. William at 10 was quiet and watchful, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's patience, already showing a talent for woodwork that made Emmett's chest tight with pride. Josiah had become, against all probability, and to his own considerable surprise, a writer. The reading lessons Clara had given him by firelight had unlocked something in the youngest Kincaid brother that had been waiting his whole life to be released. He wrote stories about the frontier, about the mountains, about the animals and the weather and the hard, beautiful life they lived. He sent them to a literary magazine in Denver under a pen name, and when the first one was published, Clara cried, and Josiah pretended not to notice, and Emmett bought every copy Harding could order. Silas married Margaret Hadley, the mayor's widow, who had found her courage the day Clara found hers. They built a house halfway between the mountain and the town, a compromise that suited them both, and their home became the bridge between the Kincaid world and the world below. Elk Ridge itself had transformed beyond recognition. Cordelia Pruitt's trial in the territorial capital ended in conviction. Sheriff Denton resigned and left town. Harlan Marsh closed his store and moved to Denver, unable to face the community that now saw him clearly for what he had always been. Levi Briggs, the barefoot boy who had thrown his coat around Clara's shoulders on the worst day of her life, grew into a fine young man who apprenticed at Harding's store and eventually took it over when the old storekeeper retired. 25 years passed. Hope at 25 was married to a good man, a rancher's son from the next valley, who had survived Emmett's interrogation and Josiah's glare, and Silas's cheerful but pointed questions about his intentions. They had a daughter of their own, a 2-year-old named Margaret Rose, who had her grandmother Clara's blue eyes and her grandfather Emmett's stubborn chin. William at 20 was managing the ranch with quiet competence, his father's steady presence beside him. Less as supervisor now and more as companion, two men who understood each other the way mountains understand weather. Emmett moved slower now. There was silver in his chestnut hair and deeper lines around those amber eyes. His hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of building, still reached for Clara's every evening by the fire. Still held hers with the same careful strength he had shown that first night in the stable loft, when she had taken his hand and told him she believed him and the stone had finally begun to crack. Clara had silver threads in her honey blonde hair. Her hands, once soft from Boston boarding houses, bore the permanent calluses of a woman who had hauled water and split kindling and worked leather and planted gardens for a quarter century. She wore her mother's cameo every day, pinned over her heart the same brooch with the bent pin that had never been straightened, because the bend was part of the story, and the story was worth keeping exactly as it was. On a warm afternoon in late summer, 25 years after a stagecoach had deposited a frightened girl with a carpetbag into the dust of Elk Ridge, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin Emmett had built and rebuilt and expanded until it was no longer a cabin, but a home, a real home, the kind her mother had dreamed about, and her father had described in stories, and neither of them had lived long enough to see. The meadow spread out before her in a blaze of wildflowers, purple lupine and golden arnica and red Indian paintbrush, the same colors that had been here the first summer as she arrived, returning faithfully every year, like a promise the mountain kept making and kept keeping. Margaret Rose toddled through the wildflowers, her small hands grasping at petals, her laughter rising into the mountain air like birdsong. Hope sat on the porch steps, one hand resting on her rounded belly, where a second child grew, watching her daughter with the particular tenderness of a woman who understood, as all mothers eventually understand, that the greatest gift you can give a child is a world where she is wanted. William and Emmett were fixing fence in the far pasture, their silhouettes nearly identical against the afternoon sky, shoulder to shoulder, moving in the same rhythm. Clara watched them and felt her chest ache with a fullness that had no name. Silas and Margaret were in the kitchen, their laughter floating through the open window, warm and familiar after all these years. Silas's laugh had not changed since the first time Clara heard it the morning after her first ride up the mountain, when he had grinned at her and called her brave or crazy, and the jury was still out. Josiah sat under the old pine tree at the edge of the meadow, a notebook on his knee, a pen in the hand that had once struggled to form the letter A. He was writing again, lost in whatever world lived between his ears and the page, and Clara smiled because she remembered a night by firelight when those same hands had shaken with the effort of holding a pen, and a young man's voice had said, "Don't tell Silas." And a secret had become a bridge, had become a life. Clara looked down at her hands. Her mother's cameo was pinned at her throat as it had been every day for 25 years. The pin was still bent from the day Cordelia Pruitt tore it from her dress in the middle of Main Street. Clara had never fixed it. The bend was part of who she was now, part of what she had just survived, part of what had led her here to this porch, this mountain, This life that no one, least of all Clara herself, had ever imagined possible. Emmett came up from the pasture wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, his stride longer and slower than it once was, but still covering ground the way only a tall man can. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, and even after 25 years, even after a lifetime of mornings and evenings and seasons and storms, the sight of him still made something tighten in Clara's chest. He was older. They both were, but his eyes were the same. Amber and clear and warm, the same eyes that had looked through her that first day in the doorway and somehow impossibly seen something worth keeping. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Clara looked out at the meadow, at her granddaughter chasing butterflies, at her daughter round with new life, at her son strong and steady at 20, at Silas and Margaret still laughing after all these years, at Josiah writing the stories that a woman from Boston had taught him to read. She thought about a stagecoach stopping in a cloud of dust, about a carpetbag that barely made a sound when it hit the dirt, about a man who said, "That concludes my obligation," and a woman who said, "You should be careful, dear," and a boy who said, "Then you might be in luck," about a mountain trail that almost killed her, and a cabin door that opened to reveal the tallest man she had ever seen, with the saddest eyes she had ever looked into. She thought about buttons scattered in the dust like broken promises, about a 12-year-old boy with bare feet who was braver than every adult in Elk Ridge, about three brothers who rode out of the mountains like a gathering storm and changed everything with two words: "That's enough." "I'm thinking about the day I stepped off that stagecoach into nothing," Clara said, her voice soft with 25 years of distance and gratitude. "And how everything I have, everything I love, every part of this life we built started with that one terrible day when I had nothing left to lose." Emmett put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. She fit against his side the way she always had, small and solid and exactly right, the way a key fits a lock, the way a song fits a silence, the way a woman who crossed a continent with nothing but a carpetbag and a cameo brooch fit a man who had lost everything and didn't know he was waiting to be found. "You're home now," he said. The same words he had said 1,000 times. The same words he would say 1,000 more. Not because she needed reminding, but because some truths bear repeating, the way some fires need tending with care and constancy, and the understanding that warmth once found is worth protecting for as long as you have breath to feed it. "I've been home for 25 years, Clara said. Emmett kissed the top of her head. "Welcome home anyway, Mrs. Kincaid." Behind them, Margaret Rose laughed in the wildflowers. The mountains held the sky. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like a voice singing a song that has no words, but that everyone recognizes because it is the sound of a place where you are known, where you are wanted, where you belong. Clara Whitfield arrived in Elk Ridge with nothing. They tore her address. They tried to tear her spirit. They told her she was not enough and would never be enough and had no place in the world they had built for people who were better than her. But Clara Kincaid, wife, mother, grandmother, survivor, beloved, had everything that mattered. A home on a mountain, a family forged from grief and courage, and the stubborn refusal to let the world decide her worth. Three brothers who would burn down the sky to keep her safe. And a love that was earned, not given, built board by board, and season by season, and choice by choice, the way all the strongest things in this world are built. With their own hands. She was enough. She had always been enough, and she always would be. Winter always ends, and what they built together that lasts forever.